Hey everyone! I'm going to try something a little bit different for our week 2 yellow wallpaper teaching today. I have up until this point been trying to do this at my desk, taking these videos, and anybody who knows my teaching style or has had me before can tell you that is not how I teach. I am not a stand at a podium teacher. I typically move all around the room. I talk to the students. I put you guys in groups. So online is a very different format for me, and I'm learning it. Like I said, when I posted about our class, I'm learning it right along with you guys. So I'm going to try and do these videos more naturally for myself, where I'm up and I'm talking and I'm teaching. It's always a little strange to not have anybody to talk back to me, but I'll see what I can do to carry the conversation on myself. So for today, we're going to talk about the yellow wallpaper, and I think you can kind of see that. And I will follow up with this with some transcript notes, so that will be a little bit helpful for you. If you can't keep up with what I'm writing on the board, don't worry about it. There'll be a presentation that I'll post later that will have better notes for you. But I want to talk about the yellow wallpaper. A couple of things I want to show you. So most of you, by this point, you should have gotten the book. This is what it looks like. All of your readings are inside here. And so the yellow wallpaper is here on page 64. So if you're following along, you can turn to that page. And it's by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Right next to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's name are these dates. Those are her birth and death dates. These are important for you to know every time you start a story, because you need to know the world that the author lived in and what he or she might be writing about. Okay, so when you sit down to start a story of mine, or that I've assigned to you, you're going to take a look both at the author to see if you recognize the name. If you want to take a minute to research the author a little bit, that can provide some of that historical context that we were talking about in the last session. You want to take a note of the name of the story, of the title, okay? The title of this is The Yellow Wallpaper. Now, if you've not read it yet, you know that somewhere in here is probably going to be yellow wallpaper, and it's probably going to be important, and we're going to talk about that. And then you take note of the dates that the author was alive. The other thing that I want you to take note of is here at the end of the story, okay? And I'm going to come close so you can see that right there. That's the date that the story was published, okay? That's important to know also for that same reason, that you can provide some historical context to what this story is going to be about. So the Yellow Wallpaper was published in the late 1800s, in 1892. And it was at a time when life looked very different for women than it did for men. You should have done in your reading for this week the section on gender criticism. And so that's what we're going to focus on as we move through the Yellow Wallpaper. So let's take a look at the very beginning of the story, and then we'll jump into some of the plot points. The story opens up here with this first little tiny paragraph, and it says, "It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer." So this tells you a couple of things. The author, or the narrator is married, right, to a man named John. This is important because John is her husband. He's one of our main characters. And John is a very static character. As we move through, remember we talked in the other video that a static character is a character who doesn't change very much through the course of the story. John is your typical male husband during this time period. Hence the name John, right? He's named a very bland, basic name because he is meant to represent sort of your everyman. Then we have our narrator, and as you move through this story, there's sort of one thing that you don't ever find out, and that is her name. So we've got our narrator, but she's nameless. That's really important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that might be important moving forward. So we have our main male character, John, the husband, and then we have our main character, our narrator, who goes nameless. There's a moment at the end where the name Jane is introduced, and it's possible that it might be Jane, that might have been her. It's never confirmed for us, but if it is, even that is really interesting because Jane is just the feminized form of the name John. So her existence is just the female version of her husband. And this is representative of what a lot of women felt at this time. And then we have a little bit of setting. And the setting here is this ancestral halls. And I'm going to write down the word Gothic. So the ancestral halls here are this mansion that she and John are now going to spend the summer at. Gothic literature conventions are very common, commonly things like the haunted house convention. So if you think about any dark and stormy night story, you've got the mansion that's sort of crumbling down. It's abandoned. Nobody's been there for a long time. Usually got vines growing up all over, and there's some sort of supernatural creepiness to this story. This story is considered a Gothic story, and it fits all of those conventions. One of the main things I want to talk about in this video is why they're up at this mansion. And to get into that, we're going to get into some of the gender role issues that show up in this story. So it was common back then, during this time period, for women to be diagnosed as suffering from something called nervousness, okay, or nervous disorder. You might not have heard the word hysteria. Okay, women would be diagnosed with hysteria or this nervous disorder, and all it really meant was that they were unhappy and they didn't really know why, or they were anxious, or they would have sort of depressive moods, and it was a range of emotions that was specific in this diagnosis to women. Of course, I'm sure men had these emotions as well, but they weren't diagnosed with anything when they had them. The women were diagnosed with these sort of nervous disorders or this hysteria. Now, if you were to look up the definition of hysteria, you would find something like irrational upset, right? If somebody is hysterical, we know that they're irrational. We know that usually they're out of control. It's not something that we use to describe somebody who's really sad and we feel sorry for. It is usually used to write somebody off who's being overly dramatic, or who's being upset with no cause, or out of control upset. Okay, so I'm going to show you something. This word hysteria comes with the root word hyster. Okay, the Latin root hyster. Hyster also shows up in another word that you may have heard before, which is a hysterectomy. Hysterectomy means removal of the uterus. It is usually when a woman has something like uterine cancer or something like that, she will have a hysterectomy. So that is because hyster means uterus. So the word hysteria, to mean out of control anguish, literally means the disease of having a uterus, right? It's the woman's disease. So if you are out of control and angry, it's simply because you're a woman who has a uterus, right? And that's when this is all when this started to come about, back in the late 1800s. And actually, it was really sort of moving through the 1800s. But Charlotte Perkins Gilman was at a point where she felt she could discuss it in her literature in the late 1800s. And there were other women at that time period who were starting to be more vocal about this diagnosis of nervous disorder, this diagnosis of hysteria that had been previously treated with this rest cure, which we will talk more about. And the women were starting to say, I don't think that's it. I don't think that this is helping. I don't think rest is what I need. Women were suffering from these nervous disorders often because, especially women of a certain class, and let's be very clear here, Charlotte Perkins Gilman is talking about white, wealthy women. That's who she is focusing on in this story. That is who her narrator is. This is not something that everybody dealt with. Wealthy white women dealt with it because during that time, if you were a wealthy woman, especially a wealthy white woman, you were not really doing much of anything. You weren't working. You had somebody to clean your house. You usually had somebody to do your cooking. You usually had a nurse of some sort to take care of your kids. And your sole job was to be the social organizer for your family and to entertain. Not to do any of the work for the entertaining, just to show up and be social. And women found that very difficult. And so they would start to get these sort of nervous disorders from this lack of doing anything. Another short novella to check out is Kate Chopin's The Awakening. She talks about the same thing, where she was sort of this kind of cushy, well brought up, but not really able to do anything wife, and she just can't hang. She needs to get out of it. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but she does. So that's where we are at in the beginning of this story. This woman has been brought, our narrator, our nameless narrator, has been brought to this ancestral mansion for a rest cure. And as we move through the story, we see that she's writing. That's what we're reading is her journal. Like that's what she's writing her journal to as the story. That's the form that the story takes. But she has to do it in secret because John doesn't want her to do any of this. He thinks it's too demanding for her. It's too tiring. So she's not allowed to go outside, take walks, because that could tire her out too much. She's not allowed to write in her journal because that could tire her out too much. So all she has to do is think about this house that she's in. And John puts her upstairs in this room that she refers to as the nursery. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diction and imagery here. Diction, as you've seen in your literary terms videos that I've posted, refers to word choice. It refers to the different word choices that the author used to describe. It could be verb choices, it could be descriptions, it could be adjectives. It's different from imagery. Imagery is painting an actual picture. You are meant to visualize the thing that is in front of the narrator so you can actually see what's happening in the story in your mind's eye. That's imagery, using very descriptive language. Diction is a little bit different. It's using words in a much more subtle way. So for example, if I were to say, it is a very grave offense that you have committed, said the sexton at the churchyard, right? Here, grave means serious, but the churchyard is the cemetery, so the word grave also implies death, which is a use of grave in sort of a more subtle way. And the author would choose to use that way to sort of sprinkle these ideas of what you're supposed to be feeling throughout the story without giving it to you directly. Okay, so that's diction. So I want to take a look, and if you're looking along with me, turn to page 65. We're going to start at the bottom of page 65, and I'm just going to go through the paragraph that talks about the nursery, right? So the nursery is the room for kids. She is up in this. It's not what the house is being used for anymore, but it's the room that used to be the playroom, and it used to be the nursery. So listen to how this beautiful kids' nursery is described. It is a big, airy room, the whole floor nearly, with windows that look all ways and air and sunshine galore. So far, not bad. It was nursery first, and then playroom. And gymnasium, I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children, and there are rings and things in the walls. So that's where my mind goes a little bit on pause, because we've described a gymnasium and a playroom, but there are barred windows and rings on the walls, and that's not what I'm picturing. I'm not picturing a gymnasium and a playroom. I'm picturing a jail. So the description that she's giving us here is definitely much more reminiscent of a jail than of a gymnasium or a playroom. Then she goes down a little bit further, and here is where we see some of these instances of diction, okay? She's describing the wallpaper and how terrible it is. And this is the yellow wallpaper from the title of the story. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles. Okay, so she's talking about it plunging, jumping down, destroy themselves in unheard contradictions. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow. So I want to write down that word there, smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow turning light. Then we've got, it is a dull yet lurid orange. So dull, lurid orange. A sickly sulfur tint in others. So we've got sickly sulfur. Okay, so if you're following along, circle those words that I just read and take a look at this use of diction, right? So these are descriptive words, but she's not describing the exact paper. She's giving you the impression of what it makes her think of. And if we're thinking of smoldering, orange, sulfur, what are we thinking of? What types of images does this bring to mind? Fire, right? This is fire diction. Why? Because fire can be destructive. Prior to this, she talks about one of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. So she mentions the sin, and then she goes into the description of this fire-like diction. What does sin and fire have to do with one another? This is the concept of hell. Okay, so she is introducing this idea that she's in hell. And mind you, we started off this conversation in a kids' playroom and gymnasium, right? So throughout this whole story, we get a lot of contradiction between this idea of childlike innocence and jail and hell. And she's being confined and constricted until we get to the end, where she finally breaks free of this yellow wallpaper and of her constraints. I'm going to have you look at that in the second video of this story so that I can break it up a little bit and you guys don't have to sit and listen to a 30-minute video on the yellow wallpaper. So I'm going to end here and I'm going to pick it back up talking about the second part of the story where we'll go more into the imagery, symbolism, and the actual ending of the story, which is one of my favorites. Okay, happy reading.